question, or we will be able to unmute you to ask your own questions. I also want to give a special thanks to our co-sponsors of today's event, the Washington College of Law, and also the Greater Washington Forum for Israeli Arab Issues. And now I'd like to turn the floor over to my colleague, Professor Michael Brenner, who's the C. Lillian Abenson Chair in Israel Studies and the Director of American University's Center for Israel Studies. Welcome and thank you. Michael?
Thank you so much, Laura, and welcome everyone to our event tonight, which I think is important for many reasons. First, of course, because of the distinct panelists, but also because it is very important for the center to teach Israel in its entirety and to host events about Israel, not only about its 75% or so of Jewish population, but also it's over 20% Arab citizens. So today we're hosting an event which will show light especially on the Bedouin community of Israel. Let me also mention that we are proud to co-host an event, co-sponsor an event on March 18th on Israel's elections, Arab representation in the Jewish and democratic state, which will feature Mohammed Daroush, Dina Kraft, and Yossi Klein Halevi, which is organized by the American Jewish Committee. And let me also mention, even before that, on March 15th, a week from today at 11:45 a.m., we will host former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak for an exclusive hour-long lecture and conversation, our annual Amos Perlmutter Memorial Lecture. It is now my pleasure to briefly introduce the moderator of tonight's event, and it's my pleasure to welcome Professor David Hunter, who teaches here at American University's Washington College of Law. His special field is international environment and human rights law. He currently serves on the board of directors of the Center for International Environmental Law, the Environmental Law Alliance Worldwide, and many other organizations. He's also the co-author of leading textbooks on international environmental law and climate change law. He has been a leading advocate and architect of non-judicial grievance mechanisms in international development finance and has advised traditional communities around the world in using international strategies to protect their rights and interests in development projects. And I'm really happy he's joining us tonight. And welcome, Professor Hunter, and you will introduce the other panelists.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Brenner. It's a delight to be here this evening and this late afternoon, and welcome to all the participants. We're in for an interesting discussion over the next hour with Professor Elsana discussing his new book, Indigenous Land Rights in Israel, a comparative case of the Bedouin. We've already heard how you'll get to participate with your questions and answers using that function. I might, if we have the right amount of time and technology permits, ask you to read those questions. We'll see how that works. After we have those questions will come after we hear from Dr. Elsana and Amal Elsana Al H'jooj. Dr. Elsana, it's a particular personal pleasure for me to be able to be here today, having not seen you since I served on SJD committee. Dr. Elsana is a research scholar and a teacher at American University here. He's an acclaimed professor of Arab world studies, legal studies, and international human rights. Previously, he served as a visiting assistant professor of law at the California Western School of Law, a fellow of the Israel Institute there. Dr. Elsana holds a doctorate degree in juridical science from the Washington College of Law. He's a recipient of several prestigious fellowships, such as the Fulbright Fellowship, the New Israel Fund Civil Rights Leadership Fellowship, and the McGill University Middle East Program for Civil Society and Peace Building Fellowship. His research focuses on human rights, indigenous people's rights, legal pluralism, comparative law, racial justice, and the Arab minority in Israel. And of course, tonight we'll be hearing about his new book based on his thesis, and I'm very excited to hear about that. Morad, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. and I'm happy to be among you here today. So they gave me only 20 minutes to present my book. It's very challenging to present the whole book in this very short time. But first of all, I'm happy to show you the book that I got. Okay, this
Nice.
was very exciting to get the book in paper. Of course, you can see in my presentation that I will share it now. Okay, just give me 1 minute to share my presentation here. So this is the book in the first slide. I'll try to present the research, the general outline of the book, and then a lesson for your questions. Of course, I will not be able to present everything, and I will leave some gaps for you to read the book, okay? So first of all, this book is a kind of comparison study or research about the Arab Bedouin minority in Israel from both national, international, and indigenous people's rights. So this book tries to deal with the issue of land for the Bedouins in Israel from comparative aspects. I will go over some of the main parts of the book, and then we'll present also the main issue of the research. So the book is divided, as it shows here, for 6 chapters. Each one try to deal with different issues. I posted this picture in order to give students and audience the ability to locate the region we are talking about. It's the Bedouins who are citizens of Israel. And as you see, Israel in the Middle East. And in Israel, we see that the Bedouins that we are talking about are located in the northern part of Israel called the Negev. Of course, there are 2 groups of people, of Bedouins in Israel. We are discussing the issue of the Bedouins in the Negev. This is another map for the Bedouins, the Bedouin region, which includes their villages in the southern part of the state of Israel, okay? Just to give you a kind of geographical location about the region, okay? When we are talking about the Bedouin in Israel, we have to understand that the Bedouins are the indigenous people of the Negev. They are semi-nomadic people. They are not nomadic people anymore. Bedouins are part of the Arab Palestinians in the state of Israel. This is also important in order to show identity, the racial identity for this group. Historically, the Bedouin, or before the establishment of the state of Israel, there were about 65,000 Bedouins in the Negev, 60,000 to 90,000. Numbers are not accurate in these statistics, as you know. After the establishment of the state, there were only 11,000 Bedouin. The majority of them were either evicted from their lands or migrated or fled as a result of the war in 1947 and 1948. But today, the situation is a little bit different. We have about 250,000 Bedouins who live in the Negev. They live in let's say two ways. About half of them live in 17 recognized villages, and the rest live in about 35 unrecognized villages. The term, the recognition and unrecognition, is also connected and important to the topic of the book, and which is the issue of the land rights of the Bedouins in Israel. The situation of the Bedouin is not good in Israel. They are the poorest group in the state, but those who live in the unrecognized villages suffer from many other harsh policies and living conditions. It also related to the dispute over land between them and the state of Israel. So they are subject to, let's say, subject to house demolition, which is a very difficult issue. The other thing, the state destroy their crops yearly, as you can see here. Usually they by tractors, they destroy the crops, but sometimes they started to use aerial spraying by toxic pesticides and other mechanisms or other means, okay? So, and the third one is the issue of the land confiscation. Bedouins continue to face a policy of land confiscation until recently. These pictures from last week, you can see tractors that plotting the Bedouin crops in order as a mean of destroying, not as a mean of agriculture, to destroy their lands. And on the right side, you can see the forces that come to accompany these tractors in order to enforce such harsh policies. The issue of the Bedouin land rights is not a new one, and it has been going since the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. The research of the book tried to show that the Bedouins had been subject to a systematic process of land disposition in the State of Israel. This process occurs in several levels, but mainly on executive, legislative, and judicial levels. I'm going too fast because I have a limited time here, okay? So on the executive level, the state employed several administrative level, but mainly they evicted the Bedouins from their historical villages and lands, and then they displaced them to a different villages and locations. And I'm writing here locations because sometimes Bedouins were evicted and located into nowhere. That means no infrastructures, no cities, no village, just go and live in the desert without any kind of human services. And then after the eviction and the displacement, the state concentrated them into a small area called the Siyaj, which is a triangle region, a small area in order to confiscate the rest of the Bedouin land rights. On the legislative level, the state also enacted several laws to continue the dispossession process, but also to legalize and to legitimize the state efforts. Among these laws, the Land Statement Ordinance of 1969 is the most important one, because this ordinance created a kind of legal system that continue to legally dispossess and confiscate Bedouins' lands, and they make it very hard for the Bedouins to challenge these acts of land disposition. The third level, which is the judicial level, which is the one that the Bedouin usually try to resort to in order to save their rights, protect their rights. Courts also created a complex process of land and placed many obstacles to prevent the Bedouins to prevail in courts. Among these obstacle, courts created a rejected Bedouin traditional evidence and required evidence that the Bedouins could not present. So some of these evidence that the court asks them to present evidence from 100 years ago, and sometimes from the Ottoman period, that the Bedouins or no one was able to present these evidence. So these requirements have been very impossible to meet, as it says here, and as Al H'jooj case illustrate them. So the first case in
Morad,
yes.
Before you go on to the first case, is it? We've got a request from the audience if it would be possible to put the PowerPoint on presentation mode.
Okay.
Which I think is, yep.
That's better.
I think that's better, although we're still seeing the next slide.
Yeah, so this is the slide of Al H'jooj case.
Yeah.
So this is the slides that about the judicial level.
There's the Al H'jooj case.
Yeah, so this is Al H'jooj case. Al H'jooj case was one of the first cases to reach the Supreme Court and to define the legal aspects of the Bedouin land rights. So in the High Court, Al H'jooj claimed that the lands are their own land based on their customary law and other evidence, of course. And on the other hand, the state claimed that according to the Ottoman land code from 1858, and here you have to notice the date, okay? The Bedouin land is a Mawat land, and that means it's nobody's lands or equal to the traditional claim of terra nullius against indigenous peoples in other states like the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, and many other common law states, okay? So finally, the court accepted the state's argument and denied the Bedouin appeal and decided that Al H'jooj case is a Mawat case. which resulted in the total loss of all Bedouin land rights. So as a result, Bedouins stopped to bring these cases to the courts in Israel for adjudication in courts in Israel, and instead they started to look for a new field in order to protect their lands. This new field is the international human rights law. So as we know that there is several protections or several instruments under the international human rights law that protect the lands of indigenous peoples. Some of these are under the International Labour Organization, ILO, under the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and also under the protection, under the International Convention on Elimination of all these, all forms of racial discrimination. So just to discover another time that even the international law in Israel is not applicable to many of their rights, and the state made it impossible for them to resort to the international law and to save and to protect their land rights. So therefore, this book concluded that even also international law protection of the Bedouin human rights is extremely limited, and protection of Bedouin land rights does not exist at all, which brought the Bedouins in the years of 2007 and 2005 to look for a different approach to help themselves and try to protect their lands. And this book is one of the projects that we started this research. And that's why this book started research in many fields, but mainly on the comparative law, in order to see how other indigenous peoples around the world were able to protect their lands' rights. And the best example that usually we present is the example of the Aborigines in Australia. There, they got their famous case of Mabo decision that recognized the rights of indigenous people in Australia. We have also to remember that there were many legal challenges for the indigenous people, both in the national and international levels, that they were to face during their journey in getting this recognition, but also at the end they were successful, and the court recognized their lands. Additional thing that we have to remember that the decision is not the entire picture of the land recognition in Australia. Many non-legal challenges and forces, both in the national and international, facilitated this change. On the national level, the Aborigines engaged into a long time struggle that brought to several changes in several levels, the constitutional level, the legislative, and the political one. Of course, we can start to indulge into the story of how they did it, but they will take more than 20 minutes. One of the main things that helped them or facilitated the recognition of their lands was the international forces and the international atmosphere during that time. Especially during that time, we had international movements against racial discrimination, like South Africa, that took place and were the focus of international law. There were also several judicial changes. So the decision was very important because it made several judicial changes in Australia. These changes are important for comparative studies like our case. The major ones are here, the three ones that the case recognized: the Aboriginal customary law and recognized their land rights. And the third one is established the doctrine of native title. It's also worth mentioning here that the book also describes how the court also abolished the theory of terra nullius, which, according to our opinion, is equal to the theory of Mawat land rights in Israel, that based on it, the courts in Israel try to deny the Bedouin land rights. So the creation of the native land title enabled many other courts around the world to follow and to start to recognize Indigenous Peoples' Land Rights. In the Mabo decision, the court outlined the basic requirement for native title land recognition, and these are the three ones: a system of law, relationship or connection to the land, and recognizable customary law. And these things are very important, and from here, the book trying to take these three elements and to show that these three elements do exist in the case of the Bedouins. And in this one, I'm trying to jump some slides in order to save time here. So when we try to apply these elements on the Bedouin case, we find that almost all these three things exist in the Bedouin case. The first one as a system of law. We all know that the Bedouins have their own legal system. Many scholars have described their legal system. Some of these, Professor Bailey from New York, and another one, Arif Al-Arif from Palestine before the establishment of the State of Israel, and Abu Hassan, for example. Those are three prominent scholars that admit and acknowledge the existence of Bedouin customary law. The legal recognition of this law also exists in Israel. The book try and show how the legal system directly and indirectly in Israel recognize in different occasions the Bedouin customary law. And the third one is the connection of Bedouin to their lands, which is almost undeniable. Bedouins continue to live in their lands, and they continue to ask for the recognition and to struggle for the recognition of their both land rights and their villages. So, which brings us to the conclusion of the book, that the legal system in Israel includes laws and the legal principles that recognize Bedouin tribal law, and thus rights, and that system of law, including their land rights. Interestingly, this bizarre but common contradiction between the reality of rights and theoretical legal situation is not unique to the Bedouins. The situation existed in the case of the Aborigines, especially in Australia, but also some scholars find similarities in the system of the systems in Canada and also in the United States. The situation is similar to the Australian situation prior to the recognition of Aboriginal land, where laws recognize Aboriginal land rights, but the states and the courts continue to deny their land rights. Okay, so this is, in short, a book of years of study. And here's, we go to the questions, and the platform is yours, David.
Thank you, Dr. Elsana. And a great summary in 20 minutes of those years of research.
Yes.
I'd like to see that there are some questions coming in. I hope they keep coming in. But before we go there, we have the great honor of having Amal Elsana Al H'jooj provide a response. And Ms. Amal Elsana Al H'jooj is a well-known activist and thought leader in Israel. At age 17, she established the first Bedouin women's organization. Today, she's a leader in the Bedouin community in Israel and a key figure in sustainable community development in the Negev region. In 2000, she founded the Arab Jewish Center for Equality, Empowerment, and Cooperation, the Negev Institute for Strategies of Peace and Development, and in 2008 became the organization's co-executive director. She currently serves as the organization's director of North American Relations. A graduate of Ben Gurion University of the Negev and of McGill University in Canada. I think you're currently working on your doctorate, or
I finished my doctorate.
I
finished my postdoctorate even.
I have an outdated thing. Dr. Elsana Al H'jooj. My apologies. Amal has been recognized with numerous award honors for work in advancing Bedouin rights, Arab-Jewish relations in Israel, and innovating in the field of social work. And she received her PhD from McGill University. And it's our delight to have you here tonight. Dr. Elsana Al H'jooj, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you, Laura and Michael, for this amazing opportunity. And really thank you, Morad, for this amazing book. Actually, for the audience, I have to disclose, Morad and myself are cousins from both sides. We grew up and together in the same simple shack in Lagia village. We herd the sheep together, and we used to discuss and argue mainly around women issue and gender equality. So the fact that we are today still discussing and argue tells you that we agreed on the gender issue. So finally, we are close friends. So I'm delighted to be here together with you. I want to start with really an overview on the book and say this is a very comprehensive book that tells the story of the Bedouin ownership struggle. And Morad is presenting this with an eye into looking at different cases, which is giving us the opportunity to look beyond the case of the Bedouin population inside the state of Israel and trying to find solutions and to look at other cases that might give or shed a light on how people in the Negev can deal with this issue. So from my perspective as an activist, but not only as an activist, also as an academic, I look at the book and I see two, I might say, takeaway from Murad's book. One is a very pessimistic one, which is really tells the facts that if the book is showing us that this issue of land recognition is resolved in cases like Australia and Canada, based on the recognition of people as indigenous, recognition of people systems of law, the indigenous systems of law, why the case in Israel is not resolved until this moment. And one of the thoughts about this is that in Israel, comparing to the other two cases, we still going through the conflict. The Palestinian-Israeli conflict is still going, and these issues are in the shadow of that conflict. And the Bedouin community is part of the Palestinian people. So linking Bedouins with the Palestinian case is very, very complicated and absolutely make the case of the Bedouin population very complex and very challenging. This is one. The second thing is that Israel still doesn't recognize the Bedouin community as indigenous. They don't see the Bedouin as indigenous minority in Israel, and thus any application that comes after is not something that will be recognized by Israel. The opposite, Israel is denying the fact that the Bedouin community and the Bedouin minority are the indigenous people in the land of the Naqab and the Negev. And when Morad is showing in his book that there are 3 points that can play in a positive way that can help us in making sure that land and the reclaim of ownership will be resolved, is that Israel recognize the customary law, but it's not exactly that it is formally they would recognize it, but we see how politics and how policies are not exactly following these rules, and there is a way to avoid and put obstacles and a way to use this customary law, and Israel would choose when it's really serving its policy that they will use these customary laws, but if it's not, then they won't use it and they won't apply it. But what's optimistic, the optimistic way of looking at what Morad has been bringing through his book is really that for many, many years, activists from the Bedouin minority in Israel and also all human rights activists were trying to understand how to really advocate for the land recognition. And for many, many years, we were trying to use the court. And for many, many years, we were trying to use the international community to really support the case of the Bedouin population in the South. And what Morad is telling us here is that it's Al H'jooj case is really showing that if you go and think that the solution will be coming through the Israeli court, even the Supreme Court, you are mistaken. So don't push people to the court. Don't push the people to come to the court, because the minute they come to the court, they will lose their case. So what Morad is telling us is that we have to use other channels. These channels might be lobby, other might be advocacy, and others might be seizing opportunities and really organizing political power. Because in Israel, with all due respect to the Canadian case and the Australian case, in Australia and in Canada, these two states recognized and acknowledged and apologized. We are not in that stage in Israel. There is no recognition, there is no acknowledgement, and there is no even apology for all these years of land confiscation and for the situation of the unrecognized villages. So the only way to go about is really to create from bottom up what we call the ground up efforts to make the politicians understand that there is no future without resolving the issue of the Bedouin community. And the Bedouin community are not going anywhere. They are staying in Israel as citizens of the state of Israel. And it's up to Israel and up to political will that Israel would recognize the right for the Bedouin on their land as indigenous communities. So we are looking at this situation, I would say, from the three perspectives. From the activist perspective, we have to look at the case and understand from Morad, my son. Morad's book is that the court is not the solution, but advocacy and trying to really create a pressure on decision makers would really help create that political opportunity. And from the government point of view, we need to create that political will. We need to see more ministers that really understands it's only in their hands that finally the case of the Bedouin population would be recognized. So I spoke about my optimism, but I ended with my optimistic views, because I really believe that in the hands of the activists in the ground, we absolutely can put pressure on the decision makers to make sure that the land of the Bedouin is recognized and acknowledged for the sake of better future for the Bedouin population in Israel. Thank you.
Thank you, Amal. I have a slight feeling I understand what those nights in the village must have been like for the other people.
Yes.
Argue. Morad, before I turn it over to other questions, would you like a few moments to respond?
So I think that Amal is putting her finger on the right issues. Although we are pessimist about the situation in the judicial system and in the, maybe I would like to say also in the political system in Israel today, and this is mainly related to the conflict in the region between Israel and the Palestinian and the occupied territories, that this protracted conflict keep its effect also in the issues of the Arab minority in Israel. The situation is tough but hard, but at the same time, I think that looking at the situation today in Israel, we should change or advise the Bedouins themselves, the Bedouin leader, to change their way of struggle and to learn from issues and cases like the Aborigines in Australia and many other places. And definitely going to courts in Israel in land issues is not recommended in Israel today. We have been watching that all cases that went to courts in Israel, they were rejected. People lost their lands and went out with nothing in their hands.
Thank you, Morad. We have a number of questions in the Q&A. I'll start with a question about under Israel law, can the recognized villages, the law that recognizes them, can it be expanded to accommodate the residents of the non-recognized areas? And does that provide any additional protection or support? I added that to you, Morad.
So basically, the question is not actually very clear, but I understood that whether the Bedouin who live in the unrecognized villages can get similar or equal rights like those in the recognized villages, and the answer is no. So people who live in the unrecognized villages are denied the basic rights like housing, running water, electricity. Education is limited for elementary, and the situation is very tough. And the main reason behind the unrecognition and the deprivation of these services and basic rights is the conflict over land. Of course, it's not a direct reason, but it's the indirect one. That means the state is trying to save land. The state is saying to telling the Bedouins that this is not your land. You should move from here. And as long as you stay here, we will not recognize these villages. We will not give you any kind of services. And if you move to the recognized villages, we will be willing to give you rights of housing and all the rights. But the conflict that the Bedouins in is that the moment they leave their villages, they leave their lands, they will lose their rights. They will lose at least their legal position, right, that they can argue in front of courts and keep holding their lands. So that's the final thing that they can preserve today. And that's why they are rejecting the offers of the state to move to the recognized villages and demanding that the state recognize their villages on their lands.
And just to add, it may add something. And even to move to the recognized villages, it's not an option, because even within the blue lines of these villages that were planned by the state and by the government, there is spots of lands inside these villages that is still, there is a dispute between the government and the owners, the Bedouin owners. And even if someone wants to move there, he can't really live there or build there unless he understands that the case is already resolved. No one wants to have a fight with his neighbor, Bedouin neighbor. And sometimes I feel that this is really politics that the government also playing in this area when they say, oh, you should move to Lagia. Lagia, my village, and Morad's village is one of the 7 recognized and planned towns. 47% of the land of Lagia is not planned due to the fact that still there is dispute between the Bedouin owners and the government. So there is no even a way to develop the village. There is no way to build a factory or a school or expand any neighborhood. So the land issue is not only a land issue. It's a land and what comes on that land. So it's really very important to understand this. You are muted, David.
That happened. I don't know how that happened.
Okay.
Somebody else must have muted me. They were already tired of my moderating.
Put it in the Arabs.
Yeah. I want to hear now Talia Raziel, who's a student. We like to, we are a university after all. And Talia, if we could unmute you if you would like to ask your question live, so to speak.
Okay. Sorry, let me read it out. So on a lot of birthright, and can you hear me, by the way?
Yes.
Yeah. So on a lot of like birthright and youth group and like tourism trips for young Jews, like especially American Jews, like I did this. Like you stay in the Bedouin tents in the Negev for a night, like to learn about Bedouin culture, and you stay in these really nice tents. Like the one I stayed in had like AC and outlets, and ride a camel. They serve you like this really nice meal. You're served like the traditional coffee, and the experience presents Bedouin life as very idyllic. I don't remember learning really anything negative at all, which is generally the experience of typical birthright and youth group trips. It's all very positive. But like after hearing this and also in the past few years, just like doing research on it seems incredibly artificial. So I'm curious what you make of these kind of watered down types of experiences, but also do you think they're helpful or detrimental to the Bedouin population?
So definitely we think that educating other American Jews about the situation is very important, but at the same time, it's not fair to present the situation as in a positive way while people are suffering from the very lack of basic rights. That means you're citizens of the state. You have been there for 70 years after the establishment of the state. And when you are looking for a school for your kid, it's not there. When you want water to drink, it's not there. We're not talking about other advanced technologies, okay? Electricity does not exist. Schools without any kind of electricity and ACs or any heating systems in the winter. And people are living in a country, a democratic country, that all living under standards of 21st centuries and consider itself one of the labor democracies in the Western society, while about more than 100,000 people, they don't have any kind of basic rights. This has tremendous effects on all people there, and many times people try Bedouins according to their culture. They have to be kind and nice to the guests. So that's why they don't present these realities and they don't talk about this situation. But I am sure that everybody who went there and he saw the differences, for example, between the Bedouin unrecognized villages and the next one in Omer, for example, or Beersheba or Lahavim, he will understand immediately the situation.
Thank you. Amal, any more comments?
Yeah, I just want to add, Talia, this is a very good, point that you are raising, and I'm very familiar with the birthright, and I had absolutely challenged them on this, not saying don't come, but I said, come and let's do it right. Let's do it right. Let's visit the villages in the unrecognized villages, but also let's also visit Rahat. When we talk about the Bedouin situation, we're not only talking about the unrecognized villages. We're not only talking about villages that they don't have electricity and water. We have villages like Rahat, cities like Rahat, that you can see the progress, that you can see the hope, that you can see. So it's really very important. And I have a huge faith on the young generation that when you go there, your eyes are open. No one can sell you anything. You are strong and you are aware, and you will be able, and you have these critical eyes. No one can sell you things that you don't want to buy. So I trust Talia with your understanding that you were one of these people that no one was able to sell you anything just because they tell you the story. It's the story that you decided what to hear and not what to hear, and I'm glad that you picked the right thing.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions that relate generally to what was the strategy, or what is the strategy and benefit of the Israeli government for denying or not recognizing the traditional rights, and sort of is there what's the reasoning behind it, from the strategic reason behind it, I suppose?
Oh, well, this is a very good question, and that it brings to our minds the recently legislated basic law, which is part of the Constitution of Israel, about the nation-state law,
Yeah.
which states that Israel is the state of the Jewish people, and within that basic law, which is a constitution, or part of the future constitution of the state of Israel, it states that the state of Israel can prefer settlements, give preference for the Jewish majority in the settlements field. Settlements, that means related to the land rights and land issue. That means historically, when we used to brought cases of discrimination in land allocation or recognition of some of the villages and compare the Bedouins to the Jewish towns in the Negev, we were able to claim that the state does not have the right to discriminate against the Arab minority or the Bedouins. But now with this new law, we will not be able to legally claim or argue this one in front of the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court will tell us immediately that we are, as a court, we are following the law, and the law here states that the state should give a preference to the Jewish majority, okay? And this will make it very hard for Bedouins and for other NGOs, non-governmental organizations, to advocate for equality and for right allocations in these villages. But the direct answer to this question is that there is a kind of ideology in the state of Israel that states that the land is for the Jewish people here. And also this ideology has its implications in the law and in the policies of the state, that is stating that we should concentrate the Bedouins and push them to live in small regions, small areas, and use the lands for the further settlements of the Jewish majority in the Negev. I have several laws and statements by politicians that are trying to discover the land of the Negev or the Bedouin land as the reserve land for the future generation in Israel. That means you have to push the Bedouins out and to protect these lands. So these are the general picture of these things, okay?
Thank you. I have a couple of questions, and it's actually one that I was interested in as well. And the question is, have you looked at, or do we know what the situation of land rights and tenure decisions are in, say, Jordan, where some of the Bedouin population lives, or in other Middle Eastern and North African countries? Our land right situation, the recognition of customary traditional land rights, is it better in those countries?
So there is no one answer for these things, and we have different situations. I checked, for example, in Palestine, all customary land rights were recognized by the state because they continue to apply the Jordanian law, because after the occupation of after 1948, the Palestinian territories became part of Jordan, and Jordan applied the civil law, the Jordanian civil law in Palestine, and that's why they applied also land law. And in all this region, the origins of these land rights come from the Ottoman law that managed the situation since the 14th century. And the Ottoman law, when it comes to the land rights, based on Islamic Sharia law, and part of it with some amendments and changes, okay? But they don't have the situation of the Bedouins in Israel, okay? For example, in the West Bank, they recognize their land. In Jordan, partially they recognize their lands, but at least they don't have the issue that taking the lands from the Bedouins to the states, or evicting the Bedouins from their villages, as you can see in the Negev and also in the occupied Palestinian territories. So all Bedouins that were not able to register their lands during the Ottomans and the British mandate in Palestine were dispossessed, were deprived of their basic lands, and not only from the land ownership, but were evicted from their historical villages. That means some people lived on these villages for 6th or 7th generation, and now suddenly the state comes to these villages and tell them this land is a state land and you have to leave. The state doesn't care where people go or live, and many times continue to destroy or demolish their houses. We have villages like Al Aragib. The village was destroyed more than 190 times within like the recent 10 years, 190 times, okay? This is an accurate number. And in Amal Hiran, for example, the state demolished the Bedouin village in order to establish a Jewish town there, which a clear act of discrimination against the Arab minority in Israel, the Arab Palestinian, or the Bedouin themselves. So the situation definitely in Arab countries is not like the situation in Israel.
And I would add just that the fact in Jordan is there is full recognition of customary laws in Jordan. And when you look, it's the same community, like the king himself is a Bedouin origins. It's not strangers who come to someone to take the land. So even looking at the case, might help us to see how they negotiate, maybe how the king and the Jordanian government, if they need the land for public services, they would negotiate with the tribes. So that might be something that we should learn from. But in the context itself is so different when it comes to Israel and Jordan. And this is why it's not easy to compare. But absolutely, there is a way to learn how to negotiate. And I would suggest that this is a good lessons to learn how to negotiate when it comes to land ownership and learn from from Jordan.
Thank you. We have a number of questions that I would collectively refer to as sort of what is happening with the Bedouin population to increase their political power. Do they vote? Are they creating political parties? Is there much ability to get higher education? Questions like that. So I've lumped several together, but perhaps you could comment on those types of issues.
Yes, definitely the Bedouin situation in Israel today is changing. It is improving from economic perspective, from economic sides. They have better services, especially in the recognized towns. But again, those who live in the unrecognized villages on the disputed land, the situation continue to be the worst, not only among the Arabs and the Jews in Israel, but also if you compare them to the refugee camps in the West Bank, they are worse than the situation of the refugees in the West Bank, okay? And in terms of political situation and activism, Bedouins continue to advocate for their lands in the political level, in the Knesset, in the parliament, and among Arab parties and the Jewish parties. But again, these issues are very fundamental one. And we have been witnessing that even in the Knesset, the struggle of the Bedouins is not achieving any real results. First of all, we have to understand that the political structure in Israel is a kind of discriminating the Arabs. Since the establishment of the State of Israel, for 70 years, Arab political parties have never been part of the governments in Israel, and they remained on the opposition all the time. This decreased their political power. This prevents them to make any changes and to participate in the decision making, even in issues related to their life and their future. This is one point. The other point that we don't have Arabs in a higher rank in the politics. That means also since the establishment of the state, we have never have any Arab minister in the governments in Israel. So the Arabs were excluded from the political game in Israel until now. And this is related also to a kind of the Zionist structure for the Knesset, the parliament, and the way of thinking, the ideology of the majority of the Knesset members, that they don't want Arabs to be part of the governments. And these are the results. We can see that the results is lack of any kind of development in these issues. And the Arabs' position, they cannot enact new laws or affect the major policy and major issues related to the Arab themselves here.
Yeah, I would like to present the more feminist view on this question, which is a more optimistic. In the Bedouin community, when you look back 30 years from today, you might see a very limited power and resources. And these days, there are three major positive changes happened in the Bedouin community. One is the increase of civil society organizations since the early 90s, where you see the young generation. Well, you can't just think of my parents, the generation that lived under the military regime, and the fear was the name of the game, and they were afraid to raise their voices. Our generation is totally different. Our generation understands what does it mean to be citizens, and what are the cracks in the citizenship paradigm that we can utilize and navigate to be able to really access our rights and mobilize the people through these cracks. So civil society organizations from 2 in 1980 to more than 75 these days active in the Bedouin community. Education, when in the 1991-92, there were one female Bedouin at the BGU University. At that time, I was the second one. And today, only in BGU itself, not counting the colleges, Ben-Gurion University, not counting colleges that are today, you walk around and you see all these amazing Bedouin women walking around with a bride. At that time, we were 2. Today, we are talking about 700 in the higher education, let alone all these girls that newly finished doctor, going here and there abroad. So there is women education in a great progress. Women organizations are leading processes internally, because we talk about the states here, but absolutely power dominations systems, they feed each other. The state feed the patriarchal system and vice versa. So when we talk about the case and what the state do, we still should remember what are the internal issues. And when we talk about internal issues, usually the red light is women issues, and which is true, but education and other issues are also related to internal issues. So we see this civil society organization growing, women education and education in general, and we do have a young generation who really understand how to fight within the system, how to lobby. So yes, the court is not the solution, but I am a believer in political power, political participation. And if we can vote, and we do vote, we can really influence. And by the power of civil society organization, we can move this forward.
And someone in the chat said it was particularly nice to have you here on International Women's Day.
Exactly. This is why I have my red scarf.
Very good. Well, I'm loath to go to another question, but we do have, I will give the last floor to a student, although it may be that the question was one that was just answered. But Ethan Johnson, I think it is. I'm sorry, Ethan Friedland. If we can unmute your mic.
Yeah, sure. I was hoping to hear more about the grassroots advocacy in Israel, and if there's any like interaction with the Bedouin communities in other countries, and like what the short-term goals are, especially in light that the system, the judicial system, doesn't really work.
Go ahead, Morad.
Yeah, okay. We can say that we do have a good development in terms of NGOs and human rights organization that works in the rights and the Arabs in general in Israel. There is more awareness on how to appeal to the international community and to the international law with all its limitation, but also since the 96 until today, we have several human rights organizations that trying to lead the kind of change on the legal level. They're trying to imitate the ACLU organizations in the United States and to develop more robust human rights issues in Israel. But with these things said, at the same time, unfortunately, among the Bedouins, human rights organizations continue to be weak. Activists are not also well educated, and this is related to historical events, the long term of oppression, and uneducated people. As Amal said, today we have plenty of women on the higher education system, but at the same time, 10 years ago, for example, we went to appeal to establish a high school in one of the Bedouin unrecognized villages. When we checked the situation there, we were shocked to see that we have 87% dropout rate among these girls. 87%. That means when you get 100 girls on elementary school, only 13 finish high school, okay? Which is a total destruction for the community and for the women. And we have a say in Arabic that mother is university. If she is educated, all will be educated. And if the mother is not educated, then don't expect educated generations. And that's the importance of education for women. And they are sometimes suffer from both the tradition that deprive them the right to travel and to go out, and the state policies that reject and refuse to give them rights accessible to their villages. Okay, so that's in general.
I want to add to Murad's point. I think what we should do, Murad, is that your book should be really summarized in Arabic, if this is something possible, because I think the activist should understand the land issue and understand that the court is not the right, it's not, I'm not going to say the right solution. We have to still knock the doors of the court and change laws. But I think you should have this workshop with Bedouin activists to make sure that they understand how to navigate this struggle and make sure that they, in the end of the day, they can really get a fruitful journey. Because yes, you said it, most of the NGOs are relying on money from the EU and from the Jewish community in North America. And, you know, as an NGO leading a long-term struggle, it's not easy. So it's very important that they understand how to make their struggle effective. And this is a call that I'm leaving you with, Morad. And I also, regarding to the questions, there is a group called the Al-Hirak Al-Shababi that they linked with the indigenous land groups around the world, talking about land and indigenous people, land, and really connect with the new social movements that based on the identity of indigenous, and they are doing amazing work. The Coexistence Forum, which is an Arab Jewish forum, they are mainly doing advocacy work on behalf of the unrecognized villages. And there is a lot of mobilization when we look at among the civil society organizations, but still with this political structure, as Morad said, it's really very difficult to seize these opportunities. And I think always bottom up and top down are two parallel efforts that should be combined together. And just to end by saying that when I mentioned that these two systems are feeding each other, we, Morad and myself, worked, I think it was 10 years ago, Morad, in an issue when a Bedouin woman wanted to register a land on her name, and she went to the authority of land in Israel, and they said, no, we can't register this land in your name. You know what? Because you are a woman, and according to your traditions, you are not allowed to own land. So you see these games, and these games is still applicable and still played by the system using cultural sensitivity, which is very patronizing. Where is the cultural sensitivity when you destroy a 2-room shack in the unrecognized villages? So this double standard with customary law and with this cultural issue is very important that our activists understand how to navigate it.
Last word, Morad?
Yes, thank you, Amal, for being here. And as a result of your advocacy, we got the land authority to change its policy and to register land plots on the names of Bedouin women for the first time, okay? And I think that this book is an essential for those who would like to learn about comparative indigenous peoples' land rights, about the Bedouins, about the Arabs in Israel, about advocacy from different perspectives, international law that protects human rights for indigenous people and land rights. It's very valuable research, and I hope you all be able to read it and to
buy it. Buy it.
I wanted to make the same plug. I want to wrap up by thanking the audience for the long list of questions. I apologize for those that I didn't manage to get, and perhaps we can find a way to get an answer to you offline. from the questions. There are over 25 questions. I also want to plug the book as well, without taking away the unique and particularly difficult situation with the Bedouin. The universality of the question of land tenure around the world, where many conflicts in environment and human rights are at root of conflict over the colonial or post-colonial usurpation of land and the lack of recognition of traditional people's title and holdings. So this story is informative for a much broader audience. And I would say the same thing with respect to the rights of women and the need to educate women and recognize throughout the world is critical to sustainable development and human rights. You can get more from Morad with his book, and somebody put in the chat room the TED Talk from Amal, where you can hear more from her as well. Thank you both.
Thank you.
100 participants that were on the call, and everybody be safe and have a good evening.
Thank you very much. Thank you, David, for the
Thank you, David, for this nice hosting
Thank
and
you.
nice
Thank you.
moderation.
Have a great evening. Bye-bye.
You too. Nice to meet you, Amal. Nice to see you again,
Nice
Morad.
to you. Nice.
Thank you so much.